Danielle Reeves was 34 years old when she walked into her best friend's house and found her marriage already over. Yolanda had been Danny's maid of honor, her confidant through a miscarriage she still couldn't talk about, the one person she trusted with her business books, while she grieved. The front door was unlocked, careless in the way people get when they believe they're untouchable. Inside, Yolanda stood in Danny's kitchen, wearing Danny's sweater, cooking Danny's recipe, moving through the space like she already lived there. Terrence didn't even flinch. Yolanda just looked at her and laughed. "He's mine now," she said, like she was announcing a promotion. What neither of them knew was that Danny had already started noticing the missing money. The falsified invoices, the timeline that didn't add up. Danny didn't cry. She didn't scream. She smiled, said nothing else, and walked out the door they'd forgotten to lock. And that smile was the last mistake either of them would get to make, unnoticed. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from today. And if stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is even more intense. The mood board was a deep mix of warm terracotta, brushed gold, and forest green, colors that felt alive, like something breathing. Danny pinned the last fabric swatch to the corkboard and stepped back to let her new client see it properly. "These tones work with your west-facing windows," Danny said. "The afternoon light will pull out the warmth in the terracotta. It won't feel heavy. It'll feel like home." The client, a woman named Patricia with nervous hands and a tight smile, leaned forward in her chair. She studied the board the way people study a menu when they don't quite trust themselves to order. "I've just had so many bad experiences," Patricia said. "My last designer gave me a living room that looked like a waiting room." Danny smiled. "That won't happen here." It wasn't a brag, it was a fact. 8 years of working from a spare bedroom, 8 years of difficult clients, impossible budgets, and vendors who didn't take her seriously until she showed up knowing more than they did, had earned her the right to say it plainly. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her sketchbook. She glanced at the screen without meaning to. Yolanda. She turned it face down and kept her eyes on Patricia. "Now, let's talk about your dining room." By 7 o'clock, the studio was quiet. Danny locked the front door behind her and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cool evening air settle on her shoulders. The city hummed around her, headlights drifting past, someone's music pulsing a block over. She breathed it in. Then she drove home. Terrence had cooked. That much was something. He stood at the stove in his undershirt, stirring a pot of pasta, and when Danny dropped her bag by the door, he turned and gave her a warm smile. "Long day?" he asked. "New client," she said. "She's going to be a lot of work." "You love that." "I do." They ate at the kitchen table, the overhead light a little too bright, the silence between them comfortable on the surface and not quite comfortable underneath. Terrence's phone sat beside his plate, screen down. Twice during the meal, it lit up. Twice he glanced at it and shifted it slightly toward his side of the table, the movement so small and practiced that someone who wasn't paying attention would have missed it entirely. Danny was always paying attention. She cut her pasta into smaller pieces and said nothing. Then his phone rang, loud enough that he couldn't let it go. He glanced at the screen, and his expression loosened into something easy and casual. Almost too casual. "It's Yo," he said, like that explained it. He answered on speaker, setting the phone on the table between them. "Hey, you two?" Yolanda's voice filled the kitchen, warm and bright, the sound of someone pouring herself a glass of wine on the other end. "Don't mind me. I just wanted to check in. I feel like I haven't really talked to Danny in a minute." "How are you, babe? How's everything at home?" "Everything's good," Danny said. "You sure? You've seemed a little off lately. A little tired, maybe?" A small pause. You know you can always talk to me. I'm fine, yo. Just busy. Okay, good. I just worry, you know? I love you guys. Another pause, lighter this time. Terrence, you taking care of my girl? Terrence laughed. Always? Good. Okay, I'll let you eat. Call me this week, Danny. Seriously. The call ended. Terrence picked up his fork. The kitchen went quiet again. She found the receipt doing laundry. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Terrence was watching television downstairs, volume low, half asleep on the couch. Danny was working through the pile of clothes she'd been putting off all week. Shirts, his work slacks, the charcoal blazer he'd worn to his conference 2 weekends ago. She checked his pockets out of habit, a gas station receipt, a folded gum wrapper, and then, tucked flat against the inside seam, a small rectangle of paper. The Harlow Inn, Delmont, VA. She read it again, then a third time. The date printed at the top was the same date Terrence had texted her from what he said was a Marriott in Richmond, 2 hours in the other direction. The room rate was for 2 nights. The total had been split. Half charged to his credit card, half paid in cash. Danny stood completely still in the middle of the bedroom. The blazer was still in her hands. The receipt was small and white and very, very clear. Downstairs, Terrence's voice drifted up through the floorboards. Danny, you fall asleep up there? She didn't answer. She just stood there, holding the receipt, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Danny folded the receipt in half, then in half again. She slid it into the back pocket of her jeans, smoothed her hands down the front of her shirt, and walked downstairs. Terrence was stretched out on the couch, one arm behind his head, the TV flickering blue light across his face. He looked up when she came in. There you are, he said. Sorry, got distracted. She sat down in the armchair across from him and pulled her feet up underneath her. What are you watching? He told her. She listened. She even laughed once, at the right moment. She gave him nothing. The days that followed were quiet on the outside and loud everywhere else. She noticed things she hadn't let herself fully register before. The way he silenced his phone the moment he walked through the door now, rather than leaving it on the counter like he used to. The new cologne, something darker and more expensive, a scent she didn't recognize and hadn't bought. He'd always worn the same cedar and clean soap smell she could have identified in a crowded room. This wasn't that. On Tuesday, he canceled dinner with her because a meeting ran late. She said fine and ordered food for one and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. And within 20 minutes, her phone buzzed with a text from Yolanda. Thinking about you, girl. How's your week? Danny stared at it for a long moment. Good, she typed back. Yours? Crazy busy. Tell me everything later. She set her phone down and ate her food. On Thursday, he rescheduled the dinner, now Friday, but then Friday afternoon he called to say something had come up. His voice was smooth and easy, full of small apologies. She told him it was fine. She was already in her car, parked half a block from his office, watching the exit. She told herself she didn't know what she expected, but when his car pulled out and turned north instead of toward home, her hands moved on the wheel before her mind made the decision. Yolanda lived 20 minutes away, in the kind of neighborhood with wide front porches and big old oak trees that dropped their leaves in long, slow drifts. Donnie knew the house well. She'd helped Yolanda pick out the porch furniture 2 summers ago. She parked at the curb one house down and cut her engine. Terrence's car was in the driveway. She sat for a moment. Then she got out. The front window of the house glowed warm and yellow against the darkening evening. Danny walked across the grass, slow and quiet, and stopped where the light reached the yard. Through the window, she could see straight into the kitchen. Yolanda was at the stove. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater, oversized, slightly worn at one cuff, that Danny recognized because she had lent it to Yolanda 7 months ago and never gotten it back. On the stove was a pot, and even from outside, Danny could see the way Yolanda was stirring it. A low, slow circle, because that was how you made the lemon pasta correctly. And Danny had shown her that exact method herself, at her own stove, in her own kitchen, the winter before last. Terrence sat at the kitchen table. He was laughing at something. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up. He looked the way a man looks when he's home. Danny stood in the dark and watched for a long moment. Then she walked to the front door and tried the handle. It opened. She stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit her first. The smell of garlic and butter and something simmering, and underneath all of it, that same wrong cologne. Yolanda turned from the stove and froze for half a second, and in that half second, Donnie saw it. The split moment where a person decides whether to feel guilty or not. Yolanda decided not to. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was loose and easy and almost delighted, like Danny had walked in on a joke she wasn't smart enough to understand. "He's mine now," Yolanda said. Terrence had gone completely still at the table. Danny looked at Yolanda for a long moment. She took in the sweater, the pot on the stove, the way Terrence's jacket was hung over the back of the chair, like it had always lived there. The unlocked front door behind her, careless, wide open to the world, the front door of a woman who had never once thought Danny would show up. Then Danny smiled. It was a small smile, calm, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Okay," she said. She turned and walked back out the front door. The night air was cool on her face. The oak trees stood dark and still above the street. She crossed the grass, opened her car door, and sat down. She put both hands on the wheel. She pulled out of the driveway without looking back. The drive to Isaiah's took 37 minutes. Danny didn't cry. She turned the radio on at the first stoplight and turned it off again 2 minutes later. The silence was better. The silence let her think. She ran through it the way she'd run through a client problem. Systematically, without panic. Here are the facts. Here is what they mean. Here is what comes next. By the time she turned onto Isaiah's street, she had stopped shaking, if she had ever been shaking at all. She wasn't sure. Her hands felt steady. The rest of her felt like a house after an earthquake, still standing, but something had shifted somewhere in the walls. She parked in his driveway and sat for a moment. Then she got out and knocked on his door before she could convince herself to go home instead. Isaiah answered in a gray sweatshirt and reading glasses, a pen still in his hand. He took one look at her face and stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. She did. His house was warm and familiar. Bookshelves crowded with fat reference volumes, a desk in the corner buried under printed spreadsheets, a lamp burning amber in the living room. It smelled like coffee and the cedar air freshener he'd used for as long as she could remember. She sat down on his couch, and he sat in the chair across from her, the same way they'd sat 100 times, and she told him everything. She told him about the receipt, the hotel, 2 towns over, dated the same day as the conference. Why, she told him about the week of watching, the new cologne, the canceled dinners, the text from Yolanda arriving right on cue. She told him about following Terrence's car north, parking at the curb, and crossing the grass to look through the window. She told him about the sweater, the pasta, the way Terrence had looked sitting at that table, at home. She told him about the unlocked front door. She told him what Yolanda had said. Isaiah went very still. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table beside him, slowly, the way a person does when they need a second to decide what to do with their hands. His jaw was tight. His eyes had gone flat and quiet. "I'm going over there," he said. "No." Danny said it before he'd even finished the sentence. Her voice was even. "You're not." "Danny, Isaiah." She looked at him steadily. "What does that get me? He apologizes. She cries. Maybe they both do. And then what? I yell and I cry and I look like the problem, and they still have everything they had when the night started." She shook her head. "I'm not giving them a scene. That's not what I want." Isaiah looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The anger wanting to go somewhere, his instinct to protect colliding with the logic she'd just laid out. "So, what do you want?" he said. "I want to know how long." She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. "I want to know exactly when this started. I want to know what it's cost me. Not just the marriage, Isaiah. The money. He has access to the business account. He has access to everything. I want to know if anything is missing before I make a single move." She held his gaze. "I need the full picture, every piece, before I do anything." Isaiah was quiet. "Can you get that?" she asked. He exhaled through his nose. It wasn't a sigh. It was the sound he made when he was shifting from furious to focused, and she knew the difference. "Yeah," he said. "I can get it. Phone records, financial statements, business account history going back. How far do you want?" "As far as they go." He nodded once. "Then I'll start pulling records tonight." She got home a little before 11. The downstairs lights were off. The kitchen was clean, the way it always was when Terrence was the last one up. He wiped the counters out of habit, whatever else he was. She hung her keys on the hook by the door and slipped her shoes off and climbed the stairs. Terrence was in bed, propped against the headboard with his phone, already in the lamp's small circle of light. He glanced up. "Hey," he said, "you were gone a while." Isaiah wanted to catch up. She set her bag down and started moving through her nighttime routine. Face washed, teeth brushed, the small, ordinary rituals of a life that looked completely normal. "Lost track of time." "Everything okay with him?" "Fine. You know how he is when he starts talking." Terrence smiled at that. He put his phone down and turned the lamp off and settled against his pillow, and within 10 minutes, his breathing had gone slow and even. Danny lay on her back in the dark. The ceiling was pale gray in the absence of light. There was a small crack near the window she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She stared at it now and listened to the sound of Terrence sleeping, and thought about the receipt still folded in the back pocket of her jeans, sitting on the floor of the closet. She was going to smile for as long as it took. She had decided. Isaiah's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, sandwiched between a tax prep firm and a small law practice. The hallway always smelled like old carpet and copy toner. Danny had visited enough times over the years that the receptionist waved her straight through without calling ahead. Isaiah was standing at his desk when she came in. Not sitting, standing, which meant he'd been pacing. The desk was covered. Printed pages arranged in overlapping rows. A yellow legal pad with his tight handwriting running margin to margin. 2 manila folders held open with binder clips. He looked up. His face said everything before his mouth did. "Close the door," he said. She did. He didn't make her sit down. He just turned one of the pages toward her and tapped it with 2 fingers. "Phone records," he said. "Terrence's cell, going back 26 months. She looked at the page. Rows of numbers, dates, times, call lengths. One number repeated so often it ran down the column like a stripe. Yolanda's. "When does it start?" Danny asked. Isaiah hesitated for just a second. 1 second. That was enough to tell her she wasn't going to like the answer. 22 months ago, he said. The calls go from normal, maybe a few times a month, to daily. Sometimes twice daily, starting right around. He stopped. "Say it," Danny said. He looked at her carefully. "Right around the week you came home from the hospital." The room didn't spin. It didn't do anything dramatic. Danny just stood there with the printed page in front of her and let the words land where they were going to land. The week she came home from the hospital. She had lost the baby on a Tuesday. She remembered the specific gray of that Tuesday, the color of the sky through the hospital window, the weight of the blanket they gave her, the particular silence of the car ride home. Terrence had driven with both hands on the wheel and said almost nothing, which she had forgiven him for because grief does different things to different people. That's what she had told herself. And Yolanda had shown up. That was the word everyone used. Yolanda showed up for you. She'd brought food. She'd sat on the couch with Danny for hours. She'd held Danny's hand while Danny finally cried and told her she was strong and that she would get through this. And Terrence had gone to stay with Yolanda for 4 days because the house felt too heavy for him and he needed to process. Danny had understood that. She had called Yolanda to thank her for taking care of him. She breathed in slowly through her nose. "Okay," she said. "Danny, I'm fine." She set the page down flat. "What else?" That evening they had dinner at Rosario's, a place they'd been going to as two couples for 3 years. Big round table in the back corner, the same waiter who always remembered that Reginald didn't eat shellfish. It had been on the calendar for weeks. Danny had almost canceled it 4 times since the night she walked into that house. She hadn't. She sat across from Yolanda in a green dress and wore her best smile. Yolanda looked the way she always looked, put together in a way that seemed effortless and wasn't, earrings catching the candlelight. She reached across the table early in the evening and squeezed Danny's hand and said, "You look amazing. Seriously, there's something different about you lately. You're glowing." "Just busy," Danny said. "Work has been good." "No, it's more than that." Yolanda tilted her head, studying her with warm, concerned eyes. "You seem strong, like centered. I've been a little worried about you. Honestly, you've just seemed like you had a lot on your mind." "Have I?" Danny smiled. "I hadn't noticed." Terrence, beside her, reached for his water glass. And there it was. A small thing. His eyes moved to Yolanda for just a half second, a quick check. And Yolanda's gaze returned it, just as briefly, before she laughed at something Reginald said, and the moment dissolved back into dinner conversation. A look, practiced and automatic. 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms at Danny's expense. Reginald talked about a project at work. Terrence ordered the lamb. Yolanda refreshed Danny's wineglass without being asked the way a good friend does. Danny let her. She talked about a kitchen renovation she was finishing. She laughed at the right moments. She asked Reginald about his sister's new baby. She was warm and present and gave nothing away. But she watched. She cataloged every small thing, the way Terrence never quite looked at Yolanda directly in front of her, overcorrecting, and the way Yolanda never quite touched him, the same overcorrection from the other side. The careful distance of 2 people managing the space between them. She had thought it was just friendship once. Now she understood the whole architecture of it. She left the dinner with something new sitting in her chest. Not just grief, not even anger, exactly. Something quieter and more useful than anger. She wasn't just watching anymore. She sent Isaiah the message at 11:43, sitting in the car in her own driveway before going inside. "Keep digging. I want to know about the money, too." Isaiah called her on a Wednesday morning, right between her 9 o'clock site visit and a 10:30 vendor meeting she'd have to push. "Come in," he said. "Now, if you can." She could tell from the 2 words that it was bad. The desk looked the same as last time, covered, organized in that careful way Isaiah had when the news was serious enough to require a system. But this time, there were green folders mixed in with the white ones, her firm's colors. She recognized the account header on the top page before she even sat down. Her business account. "How long?" she asked. 14 months, Isaiah said. He didn't sit either. First withdrawal was small, $400, moved to a secondary account I traced back to Terrence. I thought it might be a bookkeeping error. Then I looked further. He slid the first folder across the desk to her. She opened it. The withdrawals were listed in chronological order, each one highlighted in yellow, each one with a corresponding note in the margin in Isaiah's handwriting. Small amounts at first, then bigger. 1,000 here, 1,800 there. One transfer in March, nearly $4,000 in a single move, pulled the same week she'd been short on a contractor payment and spent 3 days thinking she'd miscalculated her own budget. She hadn't miscalculated. Where did it go? She asked, though some part of her already knew. Isaiah opened the second folder. Lease payments for an apartment on the north side of town, a jewelry store receipt, 2 restaurant charges at places Danny had never been, a car service Terrence had booked, billed to a card linked to her business line, Yolanda's apartment, Yolanda's gifts, Yolanda's life, built quietly on money Danny had earned, that her clients had trusted her with. That was supposed to pay for materials and labor and keep her projects running clean. She turned the page. And there it was, the name she'd been hoping not to see. Marsh Renovation, materials hold, Phase 2 deposit, $6,200. Allocated, documented, withdrawn, Ophelia Marsh's renovation, the biggest project on Danny's board. A woman who had trusted Danny for 6 years, who had referred her to half the clients that built her firm, who had handed over the keys to her home and said, "I trust you completely." And Terrence had reached into the account tied to that project and taken from it like it was nothing, like it was his. Danny closed the folder. She didn't move for a moment. The office was quiet. Down the hall someone was running a printer. He didn't know which accounts he was pulling from, Isaiah said carefully. He had access to the joint business line, and I don't think he tracked it carefully enough to realize the Marsh funds were staged there. "That doesn't matter," Danny said. "No," Isaiah agreed. "It doesn't. Because it wouldn't matter to Ophelia. It wouldn't matter to a contractor who didn't get paid. It wouldn't matter to anyone looking at the records from the outside, where all they'd see was Danny Reeves, project lead, account holder, the name on every invoice, running a shortfall on a client's renovation. 8 years of building something clean and careful, and Terrence had been quietly bleeding it out to fund a life with her best friend. She spent the rest of that afternoon in her own office, door closed, pulling every statement she had access to. She moved through them the way Isaiah had taught her years ago, methodically, one line at a time, matching every outgoing amount against the vendor invoices she had on file. Most of them cleared. Some didn't. She flagged each discrepancy with a paperclip and a sticky note, writing the date, the amount, the gap between what was recorded and what had actually reached the vendor. She built a second file, separate from the shared accounts, on her own laptop, password she'd never given Terrence. She did not rush. She did not let herself get ahead of the evidence. She documented each gap the same careful way, letting the picture assemble itself from the facts rather than from her anger. By 4 o'clock, she had 11 discrepancies documented. 11, spanning 14 months. One of them was Ophelia's. That one she would handle first. She called Ophelia from her car, parked outside the office with the windows up. "Danny," Ophelia said warmly, "I was just thinking about you. The tile samples came in. I'm obsessed with the second option, the one with the warm undertone." "The Calicata," Danny said. "Good choice. That's the one I'd have pushed you toward anyway." Ophelia laughed. "You always know." "I'm calling to confirm the Phase 2 timeline," Danny said, steady and easy. "Everything is on track. The materials hold is covered, contractors are scheduled, and we'll be ready to start demo the week of the 14th. "Perfect. I have complete faith in you. I always do." "I know," Danny said. "I'll make sure you never have a reason not to." She meant it like a promise. She meant it like a line drawn in the ground. She hung up and sat in the quiet car, the afternoon light going flat and gray through the windshield, her second file already waiting back on her desk. She had 11 discrepancies. She was going to find every single one. Isaiah came to her office this time. He knocked once, waited for her to look up, and set a new folder on her desk. Thinner than the others. Pale blue, not green. "This one's about Yolanda," he said. "Not Terrence." He said it the way you say something you've been rehearsing. Careful, like the words themselves were a warning. Danny leaned back in her chair and looked at the folder without touching it. "Sit down," she said. He did. She opened it. The first section was a paper trail going back 6 years. Emails mostly, forwarded threads Isaiah had obtained through a contact she didn't ask him to name. Messages where Yolanda's name appeared in chains between potential clients and competing firms. Small references at first. A line dropped here and there. "I've heard good things about Laureen Design Studio. Might be worth a call before you commit." Honestly, Danny's great, but she's still building her client base. You want someone with more bandwidth for a project this size? I just want what's best for you, and I'm not sure her firm is quite there yet. 6 years of that, small nudges, quiet redirections, every one of them dressed in the language of a friend, just trying to help. During Danny's first year in business, she'd lost 3 clients she'd been certain she was going to land. She remembered all 3. She'd spent months afterward convinced she'd priced herself wrong, presented herself wrong, that she wasn't ready yet, wasn't polished enough, wasn't enough, period. She had sat across from Yolanda at lunch and said exactly that. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong." And Yolanda had reached across the table and squeezed her hand and said, "You're being too hard on yourself. You're incredible. It's just timing." Danny stared at one of the email threads until the words blurred slightly. It had never been timing. She turned the page. Why, Isaiah had separated the second section with a paperclip. He'd also underlined the header in red ink, which he almost never did. She read the header. Marsh account. Phase 1. Vendor invoice. Discrepancy. "This is different from what Terrence did," Isaiah said before she could ask. He was watching her face. "This one came from Yolanda, directly, when you were recovering." Danny remembered. It was 2 years ago, 3 weeks after the miscarriage, when she'd still been moving through her days like someone walking underwater. Yolanda had shown up with groceries and a calm, organized energy and said, "Let me take some of this off your plate. Just the billing side, just for a few weeks." And Danny, who'd been grateful for anything that felt like solid ground, had handed over access to the vendor accounts and said, "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." She looked at the invoice now, a materials order from a supplier she'd used on Ophelia's first phase. The original quote was documented, $1,400. The amount logged in the books was $1,900. The difference, $500, had been redirected to an account that traced back to a name Isaiah had written in the margin. A Shell LLC registered 2 months before the miscarriage, with one listed member. Yolanda Briggs. Not an accident, not a rounding error. A structure she'd built in advance, waiting for the right moment to use it. The right moment had been Danny's grief. She closed the folder. The office was very still. Outside, a car passed on the street below. A phone rang somewhere down the hall and stopped. Danny thought about Yolanda at that dinner last month, touching her arm and saying, "You seem so strong lately." She thought about Yolanda at the hospital, 2 years ago, holding her hand in the waiting room while Terrence stood in the corner, looking at his phone. She thought about every version of Yolanda she'd believed in: college roommate, maid of honor, the person she called when things got hard, and set each one against what was in the folder on her desk. Not a friend who had made a terrible choice, not a woman who had fallen for the wrong man at the wrong time. This was a campaign. It had 2 fronts. One was Danny's marriage, and one was Danny's work, and Yolanda had been running both for years, from the inside, using access and closeness and grief as tools the same way another person might use a key. She hadn't just taken Terrence. She had spent years trying to make sure Danny had nothing left worth keeping. Danny set her hand flat on top of the pale blue folder. She looked at Isaiah. "How solid is all of this?" she asked. "Airtight," he said. "Everything I've given you is documented, dated, and traceable. I can put together a full summary package, clean, organized, ready to hand to anyone who needs to see it." "Do that," Danny said. She stood up and moved to the window. The street below was ordinary. People walking, a delivery truck double parked, the world going about its business, unaware. She turned back around. "It's time to stop gathering," she said. "Start planning." The attorney's name was Sandra Okoye, and her office smelled like fresh coffee and old books. She was a small woman with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and a way of speaking that was direct, without being cold. Isaiah had used her twice before. He'd said, "She doesn't waste your time, and she doesn't miss anything." That was enough for Danny. She sat across from Sandra at a round table, not a desk. Sandra had explained once, apparently, that desks made clients feel like they were being processed. The folder Isaiah had assembled sat open between them. Sandra had been reading for 10 minutes without speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression was settled and professional. "This is clean work," Sandra said, tapping the summary pages Isaiah had organized. "Your brother knows what he's doing." "He does," Danny said. "All right." Sandra pulled a legal pad closer. "Walk me through the ownership structure as it currently stands." Danny did. She'd started her firm alone, 8 years ago, with a business license and a client list of 2. 3 years in, she'd added Terrence's name to a joint business account to simplify the household finances. He had never invested capital. He had never worked a single client project. His name was there because she'd trusted him, because it had seemed like the natural thing to do for a marriage, because no one thinks about exit strategies when they're still building something together. Sandra wrote while she talked. She didn't react to any of it. "Removing him is straightforward," Sandra said when Danny finished. "You'll need to restructure the operating agreement and close the joint account, opening a new one in the firm's name alone. Given what's documented here," she touched the folder, "I'd also recommend we file the restructuring today, not at the end of the week. If he has any awareness this is coming, there's a window where he could try to complicate things." "He doesn't know," Danny said. "Good. Let's keep it that way." The paperwork took most of the morning. Danny signed where Sandra directed her, initialed what needed initialing, and walked out of the building just before noon with a copy of the filed documents in her bag. Her firm was hers again. Fully, legally, entirely hers. Her name, the only one on the operating agreement. The joint account already flagged for closure. The new account already open. She sat in her car for a moment and felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, more like a door closing, quiet and final. She called Isaiah on the way back to the office. "It's done," she said. "Good," he said. "I need you to hear something." She could tell from his voice it wasn't small. She pulled into a parking space and put the car in park. "Talk," she said. Isaiah had been monitoring the financial activity carefully, watching for any further movement in the accounts tied to Terrence's real estate dealings. 2 days ago, a mutual contact, someone who moved in the same professional circles as Terrence without being close to him, had mentioned offhand that Terrence was waiting on a commercial deal to close. A big one. The kind of payout that sets someone up for a transition. Isaiah had asked a careful question or two. What he'd learned was this. Terrence and Yolanda weren't planning to come clean out of conscience. They were planning to come clean on a schedule, wait for the deal to close, collect the money, and then, from a position of financial comfort, tell Danny the marriage was over, hand her the divorce on their terms, at their chosen moment, with the money already safely out of reach. They had a timeline. They were inside it right now, probably counting down. "How close is the deal?" Danny asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She was quiet for a moment. A woman walked past the car, pushing a stroller, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something. The world still just going. "They think they're picking the moment," Danny said. "That's what it looks like," Isaiah said. "Okay," she said. "Then I pick it first." She waited until that evening. She set the folder on the kitchen table, opened it, and looked at everything spread out in front of her. The timeline, the financial records, the falsified invoice, the restructuring documents she now held. Organized and dated and airtight, just like Isaiah had promised. She knew every page by memory at this point, but she looked again anyway. She wanted it all sharp in her mind before she made the call. Then she picked up her phone and called Terrence first, keeping her voice warm and a little tired, the voice of a woman who had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she thought they needed to stop avoiding the conversation. That maybe it was time to sit down together, all of them, and talk about where things stood. She said she'd cook. She said she thought it might help to have people around who cared about the marriage. Terrence said that sounded good. He sounded relieved, actually, which told her everything she needed to know about how little he thought she understood. Then she called Yolanda. Yolanda said she'd be there. Danny hung up. She looked at the folder on the table for a long moment, her hand resting flat on the cover. Then she pulled out a notepad and began writing down exactly what she was going to say. The table looked beautiful. Danny had said it herself that afternoon. White candles, the good plates, a linen tablecloth she'd ironed without rushing. She made salmon with a lemon butter sauce, roasted potatoes, a salad with the kind of dressing she always kept in a small glass jar in the fridge. The house smelled warm and familiar, the way it always did when she cooked something real. She heard the first car pull up at 7. Isaiah arrived early, the way she'd asked him to. He came through the back door, set his coat over a kitchen chair, and looked at her for a moment, checking on her the way only he ever did, the kind of look that didn't need words. "You ready?" he said. "I've been ready," she said. Terrence came in 10 minutes later. He kissed her cheek and said the house smelled amazing, and she thanked him, and he sat down at the table like a man who believed he was managing something. He refilled his water glass twice before anyone else arrived. Yolanda and Reginald came together, Yolanda in a deep burgundy dress and a smile that was already working too hard. She hugged Danny at the door, held on a second too long, and said, "This is good, Danny. This is really good of you." Reginald shook Danny's hand and said, "Thank you for having them." He meant it. She could hear it in the plainness of how he said it. No performance underneath. They sat. Danny served the food. Conversation moved the way it always did at dinners like this, a little stilted, filling the air with nothing. The weather, Reginald's commute, a restaurant that had closed downtown. Terrence made a joke that landed soft. Yolanda laughed anyway. Isaiah ate quietly and said very little. Danny waited until the plates were mostly empty. Then she stood, went to the kitchen counter, and came back with the folder. She set it in the center of the table. Not hard, not dramatic. Just placed it there, the way you set down something that belongs where you're putting it. The conversation stopped. "I asked you all here because I want to be honest," Danny said. Her voice was even. She sat back down. "And I think the clearest way to do that is to just show you what I know." Terrence went very still. Yolanda's smile didn't disappear so much as it thinned, pulled tight across her face, like something bracing for impact. Danny opened the folder and started at the beginning. The phone records first. Calls between Terrence and Yolanda's cell, going back 26 months. Not the frequency of friends. Not even close. She laid the printed log on the table and let it speak for itself. 26 months. She watched Terrence's jaw tighten as the timeline registered. 2 years ago, Danny said quietly, I had a miscarriage. You remember that, Terrence. He didn't answer. Yolanda came to stay with me. You went to grieve at her house. She paused. That's when this started. Reginald looked at his wife. Yolanda was looking at the table. Danny moved to the next page. The bank records, the withdrawals Terrence had pulled from the joint business account, the account meant for client renovation costs. She laid them out in chronological order, each one annotated in Isaiah's handwriting. The amounts, the dates, where the money had gone. Yolanda's apartment lease, gifts, a weekend in Charleston that Danny now remembered Terrence claiming was a real estate conference. That account was tied to my firm, Danny said. My client's money, my professional reputation. She slid a single page toward Terrence, including Ophelia Marsh's renovation budget. Terrence looked at the page. Something shifted in his face, a recalculation happening in real time, fast and quiet. The firm, Danny continued, is no longer structured to include your name. That paperwork was filed and finalized 3 days ago. The room was completely silent. Terrence opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to grab onto. No leverage left. No payout waiting to give him an exit on his own terms. The deal he'd been counting on wouldn't fix any of this. Danny turned to face Yolanda directly. This next part is just for you, she said. She pulled the last set of documents from the folder. The falsified invoice, the one Yolanda had altered during the same recovery period when she'd offered to handle Danny's bookkeeping as a favor. The original vendor quote, the inflated version Yolanda had submitted. The difference, transferred to an account Isaiah had traced back to Yolanda's name, every step documented. You stole from my business, Danny said. Not Terrence, you, while I was grieving, while I was thanking you for being there. Yolanda's face was unreadable, but her hands, folded on the table, pressed flat and hard against the linen. Reginald had not moved in a long time. He was looking at the documents now, reading the dates, reading the numbers. His expression wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter and worse than anger. It was a man realizing that what he'd built his life around wasn't what he'd been told it was. He sat like that for a long moment. Then, he pushed his chair back slowly, the legs dragging soft across the floor. Yolanda, he said. His voice was low and flat. I need to go. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked to the door. He didn't wait for her to follow. Danny called Ophelia 2 days after the dinner. She didn't rehearse what she would say. She just drove to a quiet stretch of road near the park, pulled over, and dialed. When Ophelia picked up on the second ring, Danny started from the beginning. She told her everything. The affair, the timeline, the money pulled from the renovation account, the falsified invoice, all of it. She spoke in the same steady voice she used to walk clients through a project plan. Clear, organized, no dramatics. Ophelia listened without interrupting. When Danny finished, there was a brief silence. Then Ophelia said, How long have you known? About 6 weeks. Another pause. And you handled all of this yourself? Isaiah helped with the records. That's not what I mean, Ophelia said. Danny didn't respond to that. She looked out at the park through the windshield. A woman walking a dog, a kid on a bike. The ordinary world continuing as usual. I wanted you to hear it from me, Danny said, before anyone else shaped it for you. I appreciate that, Ophelia said. I always appreciate that from you. Her voice was warm but precise, the way it always was. Now let me tell you what I'm going to do. Ophelia moved quickly and quietly, the way powerful women often did. Within a week, she had informed 2 of her colleagues, women who sat on the same professional boards as Danny, that she was pulling her business from any entity connected to Terrence's real estate dealings. She didn't make a speech about it. She simply informed the relevant people, in plain language, why. That was enough. Terrence's firm had been finalizing a commercial property deal that quarter, the kind of deal that gets framed on a wall. Ophelia's withdrawal didn't just slow it down. It collapsed it. The other investors followed her lead, one by one, the way people followed her lead in most things. Danny heard about it through Isaiah, who heard it through a mutual contact. She didn't celebrate. She just nodded and kept working. Reginald filed for divorce from Yolanda on a Thursday morning. Danny found out not from him directly, but from his sister, who called her that same afternoon, not to gossip, but to say she was sorry, and to say that Reginald had seen everything in those documents, including one detail Danny hadn't mentioned out loud at the dinner table. The falsified invoice had been partially covered using a joint household account that Reginald contributed to. His money. His name, adjacent to the theft without his knowledge. He hadn't wavered after that. His sister said he'd been calm about it, the way Reginald always was about things that mattered. No shouting, no spectacle. He'd simply called a lawyer the next morning. Danny thanked her and hung up. She met Yolanda once more, briefly, at the end of that second week. Yolanda had called and asked to meet at the coffee shop on Clement Street, the one they'd been going to since their late 20s. Danny agreed. She arrived first, ordered a plain coffee, and sat by the window. Yolanda came in looking polished, the way she always did, though something underneath the surface had shifted. Her eyes were working too hard. She sat down across from Danny and started talking almost immediately, explaining, softening, reaching for a version of the story where things had just happened, where people were complicated, where Danny could understand if she just... Danny let her finish. Then she set her coffee cup down, folded her hands on the table, and said, without any heat in her voice at all, "The invoice, the vendor records, the account trace. It's all saved, Yolanda. Dated and documented." She kept her eyes level. "I'm not filing charges today. That's a choice I'm making, but I want you to understand very clearly that the paperwork exists. It's not going anywhere, and it will surface the moment you give me any reason to use it." Yolanda stared at her. "That's it," Danny said. "That's all I wanted to say." She picked up her coffee, took a sip, and waited. Not for an apology. She wasn't waiting for that. She was just done talking. Yolanda left first. The rest spread without Danny's help. Ophelia spoke to the right people in their professional circle. Reginald's family, close-knit and well-regarded in the community, didn't stay silent. No one ran a campaign. They simply told the truth when it came up, which it did, because it always did in a city this size. Yolanda began disappearing from places she had always been. The design board she'd sat on for 2 years. The group thread she used to moderate. The annual fundraiser where she'd co-chaired the committee for 3 straight seasons. Nobody announced anything. The invitations just stopped coming. Terrence, with the deal gone and the documentation hanging over him, had nothing left to negotiate with. He didn't try. His attorney contacted Danny's attorney, and the process moved forward on her terms. The house, the business, the accounts, all of it structured around what she had already protected and what he had already forfeited. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later, the final divorce paperwork arrived by courier. Danny brought it to the kitchen table. She made herself a cup of coffee, sat down, and read through every page slowly. The candles from the dinner were still on the counter. She hadn't moved them. She picked up the pen. She signed her name where it asked for her name. Then she set the pen down, pressed her palms flat against the table, and sat in the stillness for a long moment. Not sad, not relieved exactly, just quiet, resolved. The morning light came through the new windows the way Danny had imagined it would. She stood in the middle of her living room with a mug of coffee, warming both hands, watching the sun move across the hardwood floor in long, pale strips. The walls were a warm cream now, not the gray Terrence had picked, and she had quietly accepted. The furniture was low and clean-lined. There were plants everywhere, real ones, tended, alive. A linen sofa she'd found at an estate sale. Bookshelves she'd built around the fireplace herself, with Isaiah's help on a Saturday afternoon that turned into dinner, and 3 hours of talking about nothing important. Every corner of the house was hers now, fully and only hers. She had renovated it the same way she did everything, room by room, with intention, not rushing. The kitchen first, because that's where she'd signed the divorce papers, and she wanted that memory replaced by something better. Then the bedroom, stripping it back to bare walls and starting over. The bathroom, the small back office where she now kept her firm's project boards, which had grown considerably in the past 12 months. She walked through the hallway slowly, coffee in hand, taking her time. The firm had changed too. Ophelia's referrals had come steadily, quietly, in the way real business grew. Not a flood, but a current. Each new client arrived already trusting her, already having heard her name from someone who meant it. Danny had hired a junior designer in the spring, a sharp young woman named Camille, who reminded her a little of herself at 26, hungry and precise. She'd moved the studio to a larger space, 2 blocks from the old one. She still called Isaiah every few days. He'd come over for dinner most Sundays, bringing decent wine and bad opinions about her paint colors, which she ignored completely. He never once said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. They both knew the shape of what had happened, and neither of them needed to keep talking about it. That was enough. That was more than enough. She was coming out of the market on a Wednesday afternoon, a canvas bag in each hand, when she saw them. Terrence was standing near the entrance of the dry cleaner, 2 doors down. He was wearing clothes she didn't recognize. Nothing wrong with them, but quieter than his old style, less intentional. He'd lost the ease that used to sit on him like a well-fitted jacket. His posture had changed. Something in the set of his shoulders said he was somewhere he hadn't expected to be, in his mid-30s, doing work that didn't have the name recognition he'd once counted on. Yolanda was beside him, still put together, still polished on the surface. But she was smaller somehow, not in height, but in the way she occupied space. Her eyes moved around the sidewalk, the way they did when a person had learned, slowly and against their will, that a room wasn't automatically theirs anymore. The boards were gone. The invitations had stopped. In a city this size, in a circle this connected, the story had reached the people it needed to reach, not as gossip, but as fact. And Yolanda had spent the better part of a year finding out how many rooms she'd only ever been allowed into because no one yet had a reason to close the door. Danny stopped, not from hesitation, from choice. She looked at them both, really looked. Terrence noticed her first. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking away and then back, like he was calculating something. Yolanda saw her half a second later and went very still, the way people went still when they didn't know whether what was coming would cost them anything. Nothing was coming. There was nothing left to say. All of it had been said clearly, calmly, at her own dinner table, on her own terms, with the paperwork sitting right there in front of them. There was no unfinished sentence between them. No open door. Nothing that required her voice. Danny looked at Terrence for a moment. Then she looked at Yolanda. And she smiled. Not wide, not cruel. Just the same quiet, certain smile from the night she'd walked out of Yolanda's front door, with her hand steady on the wheel and her mind already moving. The smile that wasn't surrender, had never been surrender, would never be mistaken for surrender again. The smile that had been a decision the moment she made it and had remained one every day since. Yolanda's expression shifted, just slightly. Something behind her eyes that Danny didn't spend any time reading. Terrence said nothing. Danny picked up her bags, turned, and walked. The sidewalk was full of ordinary afternoon people. A man on a phone, two kids arguing over something small, a woman pushing a stroller. The sun was warm on Danny's face. The bags were heavy in a good, solid way. She kept walking, steady and unhurried, back toward the car, back toward the office, back toward the life she had built for herself, out of the wreckage of the one she'd been handed. Exactly as she planned. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got 2 stories on the screen that you have to watch next. Have a great day. Have a great